The first window of NHL buyouts opens up tomorrow, so we're taking a look today at all the latest NHL rumors on what players teams are considering a buyout for this offseason. We're also taking a look at some trade rumors involving some teams like the Winnipeg Jets, the New York Rangers, as well as Pittsburgh, Florida, and others. We'll discuss all the latest news coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. Now, as I mentioned, today we're taking a look first up at some buyout candidates. The first buyout window opens tomorrow, September the 25th, runs through until October the 8th. So teams will have an opportunity to complete these. So there's all kinds of players that have been rumored to possibly be a candidate for this type of thing. And there's lots of NHL teams examining their salary cap space. Who should they buy out? Who should they trade? Getting ready for free agency on October 9th. So there's a lot to cover here. So let's take a look at some of the top players that I feel are most likely going to be going down that road. Now, let's kick things off with the New York Rangers. Now, we have more reports indicating that the Rangers are expected to be announcing the buyout of goaltender Henrik Lundqvist. Now, of course, that will save them a fair bit of cap space, but it will cost them a little bit more later. Now, the problem here with the New York Rangers as well is that they also have a buyout still on the books for defenseman Kevin Shattenkirk, currently now with the Tampa Bay Lightning, who seem to have found another level here and have kind of resurrected his career a bit. But as we know, things didn't go well at all in the Big Apple, so he was able to be bought out and move on. But if they buy out Lundqvist, then next year, between the Lundqvist buyout and the Shattenkirk buyout, they are going to have $12 million in dead cap space. That means they're going to have only around $68 or so million in actual available space to sign all their other players, because they're going to have those cap hits from those two buyouts on the books if they proceed with a Henrik Lundqvist buyout. But I really don't see any other scenario here for Hank. I mean, it's possible they find a trade quickly, but I think they've probably already been exploring that. Best case scenario probably would be that they find a trade with a 50% salary retention. But like I said, there's so many goaltenders on the move this year between free agency and trades that teams are going to have so many options. Why would they take on an aging goaltender at a $4 million cap hit? It just does not make sense out there. There's lots of other goalies and similar to age as him that are going to be looking for work as well. Like, for example, we found out yesterday Craig Anderson's not going back to Ottawa. We know Jimmy Howard's not going back to Detroit. We know there's a good chance Ryan Miller doesn't go back to Anaheim, and they all may want to continue playing, and there's others out there too. So there's plenty of goalies. I mean, there's in all different age groups and all different stages of their career that are available between trades and free agency. So I think finding a trade for Hank is going to be incredibly difficult, and they may not have any choice but to do this buyout, and it's only going to be some short-term pain, but it's going to cause them some big-time salary cap pain. With that in mind, this buyout could, like I said, could help them save some money now, keep their goaltenders intact between Shesterkin and Georgiev, but it's also going to probably trigger some other trades that we've been talking about a little bit off and on. And obviously, they're players that we've mentioned before. Really handcuffs their abilities here to sign some players, guys like Ryan Strome and Tony DeAngelo. Then I think there's a pretty good chance that those players are going to be traded. Now, there's other reasons too that they could be traded. As I mentioned before, when it comes to DeAngelo, he's put up some good offensive numbers. He's going to be looking for at least $4 or $5 million, and I don't see any point in paying him out on a longer-term contract to be your third best right-shot defenseman behind Trouba and Fox. So it doesn't make sense, in my opinion. I think they can get some good value for him in another way between draft picks or prospects to bring in, because they don't really need that anyway, because they have plenty. But still, you can never have too much for future assets. They can't really take on much in the way of salary for the current NHL player system. So obviously, DeAngelo would likely have to go for futures. And you get Ryan Strome, they're going to need a number 2 center. Maybe that player becomes Filipino. I'm not sure. But again, are they going to want to commit a long-term contract to Ryan Strome at least $5 million based on where their cap situation is and how they feel about him personally? I don't personally see it happen. That's just my personal opinion. But these players have been in the rumor mill so much that when you factor in the dead cap space next year, it makes sense that they're kind of handcuffed in signing them longer term. So a trade does seem very, very much more likely. Now, so we'll see what happens. But Lundqvist buyout, very likely coming. could very well trigger some trades with New York. Now, in regards to the Vancouver Canucks, they're another team who is really highly speculated to be looking at doing at least one buyout here if it makes sense. And one player who many people probably would like to see bought out would be Louis Eriksson. That likely is not going to happen. Based on how his contract is structured, there just would not be enough cap savings for the current coming season, and they're going to be tied to him for twice as long as the remaining contract, which is another 2 years, so another 4 years. So that gets expensive and doesn't give them enough benefit to really consider it. But of course, as we know with Eriksson, they've given permission to his agent to find a trade. Hopefully they can find something that would really give them a ton of added flexibility. But from a buyout perspective, it's not going to happen. But we could see them look at that for a player like Brandon Sutter, or possibly even a Jay Beagle. I think Sutter's probably more likely, or even a Sven Baertschi. Baertschi's contract's still technically on the books here as well. So those are a couple of players you could look for. I think Beagle's probably less likely because he has an extra year on that contract, whereas Sutter and Baertschi are entering the final year of their deal. So that should be a little bit more cost effective for them. Like the Baertschi contract, they get a pretty good relief from. So I think Baertschi's probably the most likely, with Sutter being the second most likely. Now, another player as well is Chicago Blackhawks defenseman Olli Määttä. I know he did play pretty decently through the playoff run that they had after beating the Edmonton Oilers. Like, he was pretty good, but I still think that given their cap constraints and what they need to do, they need to sign Kubalik. He's going to be looking for a lot of money after having a rookie 30-goal season. They need a goaltender, whether it's Corey Crawford or somebody else, and they just don't have a ton of space. They've also got Dylan Strome, too, to look after. Hopefully he can stick around and kind of refine some of that magic with Alex DeBrincat next year. So the Hawks, as much as they probably were happy with how he played in the playoffs, they just need that added flexibility. And given his age, I believe it's all retroactive here that they can go by him still being a 25-year-old, which means they'd only be responsible for 1/3 of the contract instead of 2/3. So that would give them a little bit more of an added benefit there than you would see on most contracts. So I do expect him to be another potential buyout candidate. Now, another player who I thought would be a buyout candidate, but now we're hearing not so much, is Anaheim Ducks forward David Backus. Of course, we saw them acquire him from Boston last year in that trade for Ondrej Kase, and clearly I thought he might not really last long. I thought they might buy him out, free up the space, give the roster spot to somebody else, but apparently I've seen reports that Anaheim's informed Backus that he will not be bought out and that he will be a full-time member of the roster, like not to be expected to likely play in the minors, that he should be able to play on a regular basis. I mean, obviously he may have to sit out some games depending on how he plays. Of course, that's going to depend on how his performance goes. But at this point, he's not expected to be bought out and is expected to get a regular spot with the Ducks next year. Now, of course, another potential big buyout and expensive buyout could be the Vegas Golden Knights and goaltender Marc-Andre Fleury. Now, he's got 2 years left at $7 million, and he does have a form of a no-trade clause, a partial no-trade, so he can block trades to certain teams. So it might be difficult to move on from him, but he's put out some comments here today through The Athletic indicating that he does not want to leave Vegas. Even if Vegas re-signs Robin Lehner, he doesn't want to leave, and he wanted to and expected to finish out his career as a member of the Vegas Golden Knights. Well, that's all great, and I'm sure that he honestly means that. I just don't see a scenario in how they can sign Lehner and keep Fleury, because there's just no space really. And they're also rumored to be in the mix for Alex Pietrangelo should he hit free agency, and that is going to be extremely tricky here as well, given the limited space to sign Lehner and Pietrangelo. There's just no way that it can be done without moving out Fleury and more as well. But of course, Pietrangelo's scenario is far from a guarantee. He has to get hit free agency first off, and if he does, I think they will be one of the leading contenders for sure, especially given the tax break that he can get by, they can offer him a little less money than some cities, and, he can take home more money because of the tax differential there. But obviously in the case of Fleury, I really think that is likely a buyout scenario will unfold, given the fact that just trading him is going to be a challenge given his contract. Even if they retain some salary, it's still not going to be easy. Of course, like I said, they don't have the full league to deal with. And because of everything else, like I mentioned numerous times, goaltenders like this with, not great contracts or expensive contracts are going to be especially difficult to move this year because there's so many goalies on the market between free agency and trade. Teams are going to have so many options that they're not going to have the leverage that they probably would have in other years. So a guy like Fleury, I think the only way he leaves Vegas likely is through a buyout. So personally, I think a buyout is likely, but I've seen reports too from insiders saying that Vegas isn't real keen on it. But I just don't see how they can keep Lehner and really go about things in any other way. But I guess we'll see if they can get creative and find a way to keep their expensive goaltending tandem together. Because it was rumored before that Leonard had verbally agreed, it's not signed, but had verbally agreed to a 5-year, $5 million deal with Vegas. So if you're going to pay him $5 and Fleury's already making $7, that's $12 million for goaltenders on a team that's tight up against the cap. I just don't see how they can afford that. So we'll see what happens, but apparently Fleury is quite willing to stay should Vegas find another way to keep the goalie tandem in place. Of course, we saw a trade, or at least a potential trade that we thought was going to happen yesterday between Pittsburgh and Florida, sending Patrick Hornqvist from Pittsburgh to Florida in exchange for defenseman Michael Matheson. Now, we're hearing that the deal likely isn't happening after all. Now, the complications were twofold, mostly on the Penguin side going to Florida in the case of Patrick Hornqvist. One, he has a no-move clause, which I haven't seen reports saying he refused to waive it or anything like that, so I can't really say that that was the reason. I think the bigger issue was an insurance issue, whereas apparently within Hornqvist's contract, there were certain types of injuries that were insured and others were not, and I think Florida kind of got cold feet when they seen the full details of that contract or were informed of how everything was structured. Obviously, they kind of got cold feet, I think, over the insurance side of things, and it looks as though they're not going to probably be overcoming that, and the deal more than likely isn't happening. Now, could that change? It is possible, but the last reports from just earlier today that Elliot Friedman says that it's not looking like it's going to take place. But I would think at this point we're going to see the teams probably continue to trade each of those players. I mean, now that the news is out, they would know that they were, likely really close to being traded. I mentioned before, I thought both players were, highly likely trade bait this year. Hornqvist, like I said, he's a good player. He provides a lot of intangibles, but he still has 3 years left, over $5 million. He's getting older. He's been through a lot of injuries. Hasn't played a full year in 5 seasons, and I thought he'd be a prime player that Rutherford would try to move out and try to shake things up within that roster as well, especially if he can't have a consistent top 6 role. And that's just because a contract would be too expensive to play in the bottom 6. So we'll see what happens in that regard. Same thing with Matheson. I said that Florida likely was going to try to trade him. Not surprised that they did try, and I think we'll continue to see more activity, but not sure that Florida's going to get a better deal. Obviously, I don't think Matheson is really living up to that contract. I don't see him as really being an overly strong defenseman, so we'll see if he gets moved and goes in the results, but he's got 6 years left, so we'll see what happens, but I think Rutherford might have caught a lucky break that the trade's not happening, because that was not good in Pittsburgh's side of the equation, in my opinion. Now, according to TSN's Frank Saravalli, who put out his recent updated list on all the top free agents and trade bait players for the coming activity season, I guess we'll call it here, the signing season, the frenzy that's coming up here in the not too distant future. One player he mentions again that's been on there before, but kind of reiterates here, is he still feels that Patrik Laine is a high probability to be traded. He's pretty high up on that list, citing the fact of obviously Winnipeg has a couple of holes to fill between a number 2 center. They need another solid top 4, ideally even top 2 defenseman, and Laine would bring in a pretty good haul of players coming back. Now, the other issue with a Laine deal is that there's some concerns over the fact that does he want to stay in Winnipeg long term? What's his next contract going to look like? Because it's not that far away from being negotiated. Will he want to work out a long-term deal in Winnipeg? What's it going to cost? Is it really something that Winnipeg's going to want to do? Is it something he's going to want to do? There's just a lot of uncertainty there, because it seems like they're reluctant to give him that consistent first-line minutes, even though he's a proven solid goal scorer as long as he's been in the NHL. But he seems like he often gets demoted to the second line, which for most players wouldn't be a big deal, but it seems like it's really important for Laine to play top line minutes. He wants to play with the best players all the time, and to be completely honest, I don't really blame him. I think he's earned that right from a goal scoring perspective, and I think last year we did see him work a little bit more on his back checking and overall game, and it still has some work to do, but it certainly was a little bit better than it had been previously. So we'll see, but Winnipeg trading Patrik Laine was a very interesting concept. I mean, there'd be a lot of teams lining up, I think. As I mentioned before, you could look to a team like the Montreal Canadiens. They have a center iceman and a Dano or a Domi who'd be a good fit in Winnipeg. They have more than enough defensemen now as well. I'm not sure they really have a defenseman that would be at the level they'd be looking for, but they have a lot of prospects, a lot of draft picks. Winnipeg could get a good haul out of Montreal if they did that kind of trade. So a team like the Philadelphia Flyers, I mean, the Flyers don't have like a pressing huge need, but they do have a lot of players that they would likely be willing to move in that regard. Like I mentioned before, maybe a Nolan Patrick and a Shane Gostisbehere. That might seem a little underwhelming considering how each player has played, but they both have a lot of, still I think have a lot of potential longer term. It might not be the most perfect deal, but it's a good example of what Winnipeg could be looking for. And I think there's other teams out there as well. Like I said, if Laine was known to be available, and maybe he is, then I think you're going to see a lot of chatter around this player as we get further into the offseason, as Winnipeg needs to find some players to fill those holes. And they're not going to have a ton of luck, I don't think, in free agency. So we'll see what happens if Laine gets traded. Where do you think it's a good landing spot? What team could really satisfy Winnipeg's need to make them want to pull the trigger? Now, one of the top free agents being discussed out there as well is Taylor Hall. Of course, his future certainly seems uncertain where he's going to end up. And according to the latest articles and discussion around the TSN insiders, they feel that a good landing spot for him would be the Calgary Flames. I mean, there's other teams mentioned out there as well. A lot of talk about him. Could he go home to Edmonton? And the answer is probably not. I mean, from a cap perspective and a fit perspective, I'm not really convinced that that would be best or even really possible or very likely. But I could see him going down to their southern neighbor in Calgary and giving things a go with the Calgary Flames. Now, he was born in Calgary as well, so it's still sort of a homecoming. Of course, he did grow up a lot in Ontario, so, didn't live in Calgary his entire youth life, but still a bit of a homecoming. Calgary could certainly use another offensive type of player, and I couldn't help but wonder if they were to consider signing a guy like Hall, if that would trigger a Johnny Gaudreau trade. Because if you take a look at that lineup, I mean, it doesn't make sense for a guy like Monahan to go if a Hall is signed. Matthew Tkachuk's not going anywhere. I don't think Elias Lindholm's going anywhere. They have some holes in their blue line that they need to solve as well. They have a lot of free agents out there that they need to fill in. But, I mean, they could go. They do have 4 defensemen under contract next year, including a couple of younger guys in Anderson and Valimaki. They still have Mark Giordano for another season as well. And, of course, they get Noah Hannafin, too, so they could try to go with another couple of, more of a cheaper depth defenseman to fill out the remainder of their blue line. Because adding a guy like Hall would certainly, put some tight cap constraints on that team. But if they move out a player like Gaudreau, basically replace him with Hall, that would be, a little bit more flexible on what they could add to their blue line, because they also need a goaltender as well. A lot of discussions around Cam Talbot. Does he come back? Or do they jump into all those other teams that we've talked about in the goaltending carousel and maybe consider making a change, since there's so many other options that are out there on the free agent market? So let me know what your thoughts are. Do you see Taylor Hall being a good fit in Calgary? Do you think a signing for a player like him would trigger a trade for a player like Johnny Gaudreau to make the necessary cap space so they're not too tight trying to fill out their blue line and goaltending needs so they have a stronger overall team for next season? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments and we'll discuss further. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and turning on your notifications so you don't miss any future content. And give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. I'd appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.